They pushed her to the red earth and laughed as if her tears were a sport. The white of her gown, meant to glow, lay dulled with dust. The lace at her sleeves clung to calloused hands. A man in torn cloth knelt beside her, his knees raw, his face steady in the middle of the mockery. Behind them, her uncle pointed and laughed until his chest shook. His wife clapped like a spectator at a bad play. The whole compound watched, mouths open, voices full of verdict. In that moment, everyone believed they were witnessing the end of her story. But this moment was a borrowed snapshot. It arrived before the real story had had time to breathe. The snapshot would see to a longer, quieter truth. How one life had been narrowed to chores and humiliation. How a stubborn kindness had survived where cruelty needed it to die. This is the tracing back to that truth, to the house where she lived, and the name they called her at night. She rose before dawn, as she had always risen. The compound was a long rectangle of mud walls and corrugated roofs, a place where pots parked on the fire and chickens threaded between the feet of people who thought themselves important. Her chores began with the water. 2 buckets, one on each arm, 1 foot after the other along a path of hard-packed earth. Her shoulders ached from years of carrying loads heavier than her, but she moved with the quiet of someone who loved the small steadiness of a routine, who had learned to find a kind of dignity in service, even when those around her had forgotten the word. Her name was Chinaza. The name meant something like God receives, a truth her parents had hoped for her, and tucked into that hope she had been left with her uncle and aunt when the bus took them away. From the outside, villagers said she was lucky. From the inside, her life was a litany of other people's needs. Sweepings for cousins who never swept for her, laundry for hands that never washed her own, food set on plates for those who spat on her fate. Adiz and Uganma, leafy and pretty, moved through the compound like princesses and laughed like their names were crowns. Auntie Uju loved sharp words more than soft prayers. She had a tongue that found Chinaza every time and bruised. "You are a house girl nobody is paying for," Auntie Uju would say when the market women visited. "Be grateful we did not leave you from the gutter where your parents died." At night the words perched on Chinaza like a stone. By day she wiped other people's dishes until the only light her hands saw was the sun over the yard. Sometimes she would stand with the basin and think of the last picture she had of her mother, how their shadows had held hands beneath a mango tree before the bus swallowed both of their voices. Those memories were private small rooms where she kept hope. Out in the open, she kept her chin level and her back straight. Uncle Bartholomew's temper was a drum you could hear before you reached the gate. He had a round belly that rolled when he laughed, and a face that tightened when anything offended his pride. When his daughters failed to charm men with money in their pockets, he found a scapegoat in the easiest target, Chinaza. Each rejected suitor became, in his mind, an indictment against the orphan. He said the house had a shame, and it was Chinaza's shadow. The rest of the family accepted the logic because it absolved them from looking inward. It was after one such disgrace that his chest burned with a new fury. Adiz, primed to marriage, had offended a rich suitor with an ill-placed word. The man, his dignity stung, disappeared into his car and left the compound smelling of petrol and opportunity missed. Uncle Bartholomew slammed the gate and called the neighbors to witness his verdict. The clay pots hissed on the stove as if they too listened. "Enough!" he shouted, and whatever pride kept the compound in equilibrium snapped under his voice. "Since my daughters cannot find husbands, I swear the orphan in my house will marry the poorest man I can find. Let beggars marry beggars." Auntie Uju raised her hands and laughed like an accusation finally answered. The cousins joined, cruel in chorus. The villagers outside hooped as if the matter were entertainment and not a human being's future. Chinaza stood beside the fire with a ladle in her hand, feeling the heat on her wrist, and the cold of his words settled down into her chest. She thought then of leaving, of going to the market and asking for work, or of finding a cousin in another town who might spare her a bed. Pride and the need for survival braided together and held her in the only place she had ever known. Besides, leaving meant entering a world she had never learned to read. She carried the weight of being thankful for having shelter and the weight of being invisible under it. Even so, when the knock came on the gate that evening, the sound hollowed her. It was a single knock, 3 quick raps, and every head turned toward the gate as if the knock were a bell tolling for the future. The man at the gate appeared in the dusk like a memory. His shirt hung in shreds, His trousers were patched, and his shoes had seen more miles than a shepherd's dog. He moved with a careful dignity that did not belong to his clothes. He was not loud. He did not demand an audience. He wiped his hands on his pant leg, then bowed slightly as one bows before an elder or at a place of worship. Uncle Bartholomew's face brightened as if the knock were a blessing delivered in the wrong wrapper. He called him in with a voice that was all malice hidden behind a smile. Adiz and Ugama started, then giggled. The men sitting outside spat politely, and the women whispered their best insults like prayers passed under the breath. "Look at his shirt," one of them said. "He is the perfect man for the orphan." Auntie Uju wiped her hands on her wrapper and clapped as if on cue. "If Chinaza does not marry him, she should leave." Chinaza stepped forward, the ladle cooling in her hand. She could see the lines around the stranger's eyes, the way his mouth kept its kindness even when the world had not been kind. Where the others scoffed, he offered a small smile and spoke with the soft voice of someone who had learned humility the hard way. "Good evening," he said. "I am looking for a wife." The compound erupted in the sound of scorn. But when their laughter rushed like a river at his feet, the man did not run. He sat on a low stool as Uncle Bartholomew offered it, and he looked at Chinaza as if seeing a light he had been searching for in the darkness. She poured water into his palm and offered him bread without thinking of who watched. The water in his hands trembled, not with shame but with gratitude. In that small exchange, a question older than the compound's insults was asked without using a word. Who would see her for who she was, not for the work she performed or the shame they assigned? That night, the house slept a little louder than usual. The moon slipped between corrugated roofs and left silver on the pots. Chinaza folded her thin blanket and listened to the house breathe, the creak of the door, the scrape of a chair, the distant bark of a dog. In the small room that held her few belongings, she thought of the man at the gate. She did not imagine a future of velvet and feasting. She imagined only the small, human kindness he had offered and how rare that was. Morning arrived with the same rhythm it always had. Cocks crow, kettle steam, urgent voices. But the memory of the knock lived behind her ribs like a secret drum. When Uncle Bartholomew announced, with the theatricality of a man pleased with himself, that there would be a wedding before the week closed, the air in Chinaza's chest went tight. She did not know what she feared most, marriage to a stranger by a man who wished her harm, or the idea of stepping into something that might be an escape in name but a chain in practice. She went about her chores. She swept. She washed. She prepared the rice and the stew. She packed a small bundle for the unknown future. And then, just as the compound hummed with the ordinary cruelties of the day, another knock came. Quiet, precise, certain. The man at the gate did not arrive with a trumpet or a fanfare. He arrived with the careful pace of someone who had learned to step lightly across a world that often slammed doors in his face. His shirt had been stitched and restitched until the fabric hung like a map of repairs. His trousers had seen rain and sun and mud, and his shoes were the thin leather of bargain markets. He carried no gifts, no letters, no grand story. When Uncle Bartholomew waved him in, the compound held its breath as if the air itself wanted to witness the moment of fate would be sealed. He bowed when he entered, as if he had stepped into a home that might demand courtesy like currency. His eyes met Chinaza's briefly, and then looked past her to the house as if trying to learn its bones. There was something in the way he held himself, something that did not match his clothes. He was not embittered. He was not loud. He spoke in a voice low enough that the younger boys in the yard had to lean forward to hear. He said his name was Ebuka, and that he had come looking for a wife. The laughter that followed sounded like rain against tin, sharp and sudden. Adiz laughed the loudest, her teeth flashing when she could, as if the laugh itself were a weapon. Ugama tossed her head and mimicked him with a cruel rhythm. Auntie Uju clapped her hands in delight and called for a stool. Villagers who had come to gossip gathered closer, their faces lined with the delight of spectacle. Uncle Bartholomew took pleasure in the show. He prodded the man with questions he already knew the answers to and then announced, with a flourish, that they had the perfect match. The men outside made small jokes about the man's shoes. Someone murmured that Chinaza had finally found a husband who matched her station. The jokes landed like stones thrown at the young woman's shoulders. Chinaza moved as if propelled by habit and habit alone. She filled a basin with water and stepped toward the stranger with a bowl and a rag, because that was how she distinguished herself in the household, by serving soap and water, by making the small, necessary comforts of life. She did not pause to let embarrassment sift through her. She simply offered the water, placed the bowl down, and waited as her hands trembled under the weight of what she had done. Ebuka accepted the water with both hands. He looked at her with a kind of astonishment that made the men cough and the women quiet. "Thank you," he said, and the two syllables were soft, threaded with the kind of gratitude that had been missing in his life. He drank slowly, savoring the coolness, and then, almost shyly, he offered a smile so small it might have been missed by someone not looking for small mercies. That moment changed the tone of the compound in a way no one could measure. For a fleeting second the laughter refracted into silence. Chinaza noticed the lines at the corners of his eyes, the way his hands had roughness without the swollen calluses of someone heavy with cruelty. There was a steady patience about him, like someone who had folded many disappointments into the shape of his life and then continued, step by step. Uncle Bartholomew, pleased with himself, asked what family he had and whether he worked. Ebuka answered plainly. He did odd jobs, sometimes trading time for food, sometimes for a few naira. He did not speak of a steady job or grand prospects. He said he had been in town for months and had seen how people treated each other. He said that he had come because he wanted a simple life with someone who would be kind. The compound erupted again in scorn, but there was an edge beneath Ebuka's quiet, something like dignity that did not demand applause. When asked directly whether he could provide for a wife and a family, he did not answer with promises. He answered with honesty. "I will do what I can," he said. "I will work, and if I cannot provide, I will do my best to be fair and right." Chinaza heard the word fair and felt it like a small hand touching a bruise. No one in the house had ever promised fairness to her. Her life had been a ledger of what she owed, not of what anyone owed to her. She approached him again and arranged a stool so he might sit with some comfort. He did not refuse. He accepted tea when she poured it. He ate the bread she offered and spoke about small, ordinary things: the sun, the market, the names of trees. As the conversation unfolded, Chinaza found herself listening without the shield of suspicion she wore against the family. She noticed the way Ebuka's voice steadied when he spoke of mornings, and the way his laugh came out as a small sound that did not try to drown others. There was a softness in him that did not feel like weakness. It felt like a quiet backbone. That evening, after the market women had left and the sun bent low over the corrugated roofs, Ebuka asked to speak with Chinaza away from the crowd. They sat under the shade of a mango tree where the breeze kept the flies from landing too long on their hands. There, among the clack of drying dishes and the distant bleat of a goat, he spoke honestly. "I do not want to force you," he said. "If you do not wish this, I will go. I will not hold you when you do not want to be held. I have seen things in the way men use women, and I will not be that man." Chinaza listened as if the words were coins falling into a hollow place in her chest. She thought of the years she had lived under Uncle Bartholomew's roof, the humiliation served like breakfast, the scorn that had become almost routine. Freedom, even if it came in the shape of an uncertain future, shimmered with possibility. But there was more to the decision than freedom from cruelty. There was the human recognition Ebuka had given her in the simplest ways: a respectful bow, a sincere thank you, a refusal to mock. She looked at him. The moonlight caught the map of stitches on his shirt, and she saw there the story of someone who had endured, not celebrated. "If you will not hold me as a prisoner," she said quietly, "then I will go. I cannot stay in a home that defines me by what I am not. If marrying you means being seen, even for a little while I will accept." He reached for her hand then, not roughly but with a careful pressure, as if confirming the fragile agreement between two people who had survived in different ways. The mango tree threw patterned shadows across their faces, and for the first time since childhood, Chinaza imagined a life without the constant echo of insults. The thought scared her as much as it comforted her. Word traveled through the compound by morning as if carried on the wind itself. Uncle Bartholomew decided a wedding should happen quickly, before the neighbors changed their minds or before a better prospect arrived. There would be no bride price, no celebration, only a hurried ceremony to rid him of what he called his bad luck. The family set to work in the theatrical way of people who believed cruelty could be made clean with speed. Auntie Uju smiled like a judge pleased with her sentence. Adiz and Uganma rehearsed their scorn as though it were a play. Chinaza found herself measured and dressed in a white gown that did not fit the way she imagined weddings fit in fairy tales. It clung to the places that showed she had lived and hid the places that hinted at a fragile dignity she was just learning to claim. She adjusted the veil and looked at herself in the small mirror. Her reflection showed a woman who had been handed a choice on the edge of nothing, and she had taken it. The choice did not answer the questions of safety or future. It answered the more immediate need to be seen and to be treated with a sliver of kindness. They made the wedding quick, as if speed could tidy their embarrassment into something neat and final. The pastor, who had been paid with the smallest of bills, stood with a Bible the size of a palm and read phrases as if reciting a script he did not believe. Neighbors clustered at the edge of the yard like an audience at a cheap theater, mouths full of commentary. The sun poured down and settled on mud walls, on corrugated roofs, on the thin white cloth that barely held the shape of dignity to Chinaza's shoulders. Her gown had been bought secondhand and steamed in a pan until it held enough crispness to pass for ceremony. The lace at the sleeves, frayed at the edges, perched on her wrists like a memory of something tender. She had allowed a simple veil because it felt right to stand under a small shelter of fabric when other shelters had failed. Her hands shook not from the heat but from the accumulation of the days that had led here, the knocks, the insults, the quiet small mercies offered by a stranger at a gate. Ebuka stood beside her, his shirt patched, his trousers dusty, his shoes bearing the stories of many miles. He looked at her with a softness that did not try to hide the gravity of his own life. Uncle Bartholomew performed his role with a relish that made the air taste bitter. He spoke in loud, sharp sentences that left no room for nuance. Auntie Uju clapped at intervals as if to remind everyone this was, at last, the conclusion their cruelty demanded. Adiz and Uganma smiled like children who had learned to weaponize prettiness. Their laughter cut through the ceremony like knives. And yet, through the noise, there were small things that did not bend to the script. Ebuka's grip was steady when he took Chinaza's hand, not possessive but present. The pastor's voice faltered as he saw the look between them, unable to measure it with his accustomed indifference. Chinaza felt the fabric of her dress crease under her palms and felt, too, the strange buoyancy of a decision made by necessity and tempered by hope. She did not imagine grand feasts. She imagined instead the possibility of being seen without contempt. When the couple were pronounced husband and wife, the compound erupted. Some cheered, some spat, some took photos on their phones as if to archive a spectacle for later laughter. Chinaza stood for a moment stunned, the world turning at a pace that felt grinding and sudden. Ebuka lowered his eyes to her hand and gave it a small squeeze, as if to anchor them both. The departures began with a chorus of insults. Voices rose. You belong to each other, they jeered. You too are made for misery. As they walked through the yard toward the gate, Chinaza's veil caught a smudge of dust, and the giggles swelled into a tide. Ebuka stepped out first and paused at the threshold as if considering whether the earth itself had a position on the judgment being called down on them. Chinaza's heart hammered in a rhythm that seemed to announce every memory of shame. She imagined the bus that had taken her parents, the faces of those who had said she was unclean, the small room where she kept the photograph of her mother folded in cloth. She thought then, with the same clarity that had carried her through chores and ridicule, that she could not return to being invisible again. Whatever this marriage would be, she would hold to the dignity that had been offered her without price. The compound watched while the newlyweds moved toward the road. Some of them spat again, others whispered predictions of failure. A child threw a stone that missed and skittered into the dust. In the midst of that ordinary cruelty, a sound unlike the rest grew. A low rumble, the kind that makes birds lift from trees. Heads turned. Men shaded their eyes with palms and peered down the road. A black vehicle moved into view, its paint swallowing the sun in a manner that felt wrong in that place. It was not the kind of car that belonged to the village. It had the slow, deliberate hush of glass and metal, the silence of a thing that did not scatter dust as it moved. The driver wore a pallor of discipline, shoes polished to a shine, hands steady on the wheel. The vehicle slowed and stopped with a dignity that made the air in the compound thin. People blinked as if waking. Uncle Bartholomew's grin froze. Auntie Uju's clapping dropped. Adiz and Uganma exchanged a look that did not contain laughter anymore. The children, who had been quick to mock, pressed closer with curiosity. The driver opened the door with a mechanical efficiency and stepped out. He approached their gate with the composed bearing of a man trained in exactness. He set a small leather case on the ground and spoke into a phone with a low voice. Then he stepped back as if summoned. Ebuka straightened. Chinaza felt an odd pressure in her chest, fear braided with a sudden, bright possibility. The driver bowed ever so slightly and then said, in a voice that carried authority the way an old drum carries sound down a valley, "Sir, Madam, welcome." A hush settled like a hand on mouths. The driver opened the leather case. A name card was taken out, then a business card, then a small rectangle that looked to be insignia and address. Ebuka stepped forward. He moved with the same careful dignity he had shown since the gate, but now there was a difference in the way others looked at him. Where there had been mockery, now there was a fork of shock in their faces. Ebuka did not make an ostentatious show. He reached behind his already patched back, shrugged off the torn outer shirt, and revealed a plain but well-cut shirt beneath. He loosened the collar with the casualness of a man taking off a disguise. He did not need to shout. He raised his voice and spoke simply, without flourish. "My name is Ebuka Okonkwo," he said. The name landed like a small stone in water and made ripples across the gathering. "I own Okonkwo Holdings." Silence opened up wide enough to swallow everything that had been said before. A woman dropped a spoon. A child stopped breathing. Uncle Bartholomew's mouth worked as if finding a word might summon an answer that would fit the moment. Adi's face went pale. "You are joking," someone muttered, but his voice carried the same disbelief the rest of them felt. Ebuka allowed the pause to stretch, then continued in a voice level and calm. "I came here disguised," he said. "I have been walking through places that know names like mine and places that do not. I wanted to meet people without the power my name carries. I wanted to know what the truth of a heart looked like, away from money and claims." The driver closed the leather case and stood at attention, his expression blank. Ebuka reached into his pocket and brought out a small slip of paper. He extended it to Uncle Bartholomew, who took it as if it might be hot. The paper contained something their ears would have had a hard time measuring, the name and record of a debt, and beneath it the notation that connected Bartholomew to a fraud years back, a theft that had cost another man his livelihood. "It is not enough to say I am wealthy," Ebuka said. "You should know why I came. Your family stole from my father's poultry business. You ruined his work and left him with nothing. I came to test hearts and to find one that could be trusted." A murmur started, thin and wavering. Auntie Uju's face crumpled, as if a wind had hit a fragile paper sculpture. She looked at her husband with a new measurement of appraisal, not as the man who had ordered the wedding, but as the one whose past might be clattering into the present. Chinaza felt the world tilt and then level again. The shock was not only that Ebuka was not what they had claimed, it was that he had carried his revelation like a scalpel, precise and chosen. He could have used this moment for the kind of vengeance that leaves ruins, but the steadiness in his voice told another story, one where exposure might be followed by mercy, or at least by a choice. Uncle Bartholomew found his voice at last, and it came out small, not the booming parade it had been earlier. "You," he began, then stopped as if the sentence had no room to land. Ebuka turned toward Chinaza then, his face softening. "I wanted to meet you before I told anyone who I was," he said. "I wanted to see if kindness was still something a person could hold without dressing it up. You offered me water when everyone laughed. You did not use me for jokes. You were honest with me, even when surrounded by lies." She felt a warmth rise in her chest that was not the heat of the sun. It was something quieter and steadier, recognition without judgment, the rare gift of being seen. The villagers, who had been loud just moments before, watched as if their voices had been swallowed by the new shape of the scene. Ebuka stepped back, the reveal complete. The driver opened the car door, and a man in a dark suit came forward with the air of someone who did not need to make noise to command attention. Ebuka offered his arm to Chinaza with the same careful respect he had shown her since the beginning. The movement was simple and decisive. For a moment, the compound did not know whether to laugh or to bow. Then the sound of someone sobbing broke the spell, not Chinaza but Auntie Uju, whose hands trembled with the weight of a truth that could not be erased. Uncle Bartholomew's face drained of color, and the crowd began to shift its attention, recalibrating old stories with new, astonishing information. As the vehicle rolled away, dust rising in a slow plume behind it, Chinaza felt the dirt under her shoes and the lace against her wrist, and understood that the world had changed in a single breath. She did not know what the future would bring, only that the shape of her life had been altered by a moment of honesty delivered on a hot afternoon. The veil on her head lifted in the breeze, and for the first time in a long while, she let herself breathe without expecting insults to fill the space. The mansion smelled of citrus and polished wood, a clean scent that made Chinaza think of new things. New towels, windows that opened without rust, rooms that did not remember other people's insults. She moved through it like someone learning the names of colors she had only heard about. Ebuka walked beside her with the same quiet steadiness he had shown from the gate, introducing her to small rituals of this life. The way staff addressed one another, how the morning papers were placed on the table, how the blinds were adjusted to let light taste different into a room. Nothing about the extravagance felt like an end to what she had been. It felt like a new beginning that would require learning, humility, and the patience to let the world catch up. They spoke without hurry. Ebuka told her, in fragments at first, and then with more confidence, why he had come disguised. It was not only curiosity. It was sorrow and a need for justice tempered by loneliness. Years ago, his father's poultry business had been undermined by people who saw profit as an instrument and not a craft. The ruin had followed like a shadow. Ebuka had inherited more than wealth. He had inherited a question about human character he wanted answered without the interference of names and titles. He had walked the streets, taken jobs that humbled him, and watched how people treated one another when money and power were not the actors in the scene. He did not expect to find someone like Chinaza. He did not expect that the rare kindness she offered, simple, unconditional, would be the thing that guided his choice. Chinaza told him what the house had been. She told him about the ladle that had burned her hand, about nights when her blanket felt too thin against the cold of insults, about the photograph of her mother wrapped in cloth. She did not dramatize. She did not need to. The facts lived in her voice, steady and exact, the way a river names the stones it carries. Ebuka listened as if each detail mattered, because it did. He did not respond with pity, he responded with recognition. The recognition was perhaps the most tender comfort she had ever been offered. After a few days in the mansion, they decided to return to the compound. It was not a show of triumph. It was a decision grounded in a sense of responsibility and of the need for clarity. Ebuka could have chosen to sever everything and leave the past to fester. Instead, he chose to face it with Chinaza by his side. The SUV rolled into the dusty lane, and the compound gathered as if a magnet had moved through the village and dragged everyone with it. When they stepped out, the faces that had mocked moments earlier were drawn into lines of astonishment that made them appear younger and smaller than before. Uncle Bartholomew stood in the doorway, hands on hips as if to hold up a shield he no longer believed in. Auntie Uju's face had the slackness of someone who had been surprised by an event too big for her usual bravado. Adis and Yaganma peered from behind a curtain, the bravado gone like someone had turned off a lamp. The neighbors clustered with a dozen opinions that had nowhere to land. Ebuka placed a thick envelope on the table in the main room. It contained copies of documents, records of business transactions, communication that tied Uncle Bartholomew's name to the collapse of several shipments years before. The paper did not need to shout. The small black ink letters spoke with the authority of facts. "You have a choice," Ebuka said, measured and calm. "I could use this to bring the full force of the law and ruin what is left of your reputation. I could make sure that every place that ever tolerated your theft knows your name. Or we can choose another path." Auntie Uju's hands trembled, and she clasped them as if to stop a leak. Uncle Bartholomew's mouth opened and closed like a fish. Words came out that were small and pleading, stripped of the swagger they had once had. The compound that had once cheered now sat in a silence heavy enough to be felt. Chinaza stood then, the lace of her wedding sleeve soft against her wrist. Her voice was steady. There were still tremors inside it, but her words were clear. "You told me I would marry a beggar. You said my life had no worth. You made fun of the memory of my parents. You reduced me to a thing that could be given away. I could make you pay for that in ways that would echo for years, but I will not do that." She pressed a small envelope into Uncle Bartholomew's hands. It was not an accusation disguised as charity. It was a loan, enough to patch the roof, buy new pots, and fix what would break first. Use this money to start repairing what you broke, she said. Fix your house. Learn to be better. If you choose to change, we will not stand in your way. If you choose the other path, then the consequences are yours. Her words landed with a gravity that made people breathe differently. Ebuka's face remained composed. He had the documents, he had the power to destroy, but there was a line he did not want to cross. His purpose in coming had not been to become an executioner. It had been to find truth and decide how to hold it. Uncle Bartholomew sank into a chair as if the world had become heavier. He reached for the envelope, and his fingers closed around it with the awkwardness of a man who had never been offered a second chance without strings. For a moment he flinched between pride and something like shame. Auntie Uju's shoulders shook, and she began to cry openly, the sound small and brittle. Adiz and Uganma stepped forward timidly, their earlier cruelty replaced by an embarrassment that made them shrink against the plaster. The neighbors murmured among themselves, recalibrating the stories they had fed on for years. A woman who had once laughed the loudest looked away, her laughter gone, as if someone had taken the wind out of a sail. The compound tasted different. It was as if a new rule had been written in the space between the roof and the earth. Being cruel may hurt for a while, but it does not last forever. After the confrontation, Chinaza returned to the mansion with Ebuka. Life settled into a rhythm that was both strange and comforting. She learned how to sign her name with a pen that did not threaten to slip, how to answer a phone politely, how to sit at a table where plates were placed for her. She did not abandon the small things that had shaped her. She still woke early and made the first pot of tea, not out of obligation, but because these acts had become part of who she was. Ebuka never asked her to forget. He only asked her to remember with gentleness. They founded a small program a few months later, a place where women like Chinaza could learn skills, where widows could be helped to start small businesses, where girls who had been sold or forced into service could come and be taught how to sew and manage money. The foundation was modest at first, a room in a building with a few sewing machines, donated cloth, and a teacher who had once worked in an old tailoring shop. It did not shout. It did what work needed to be done. It trained hands and gave dignity back through skill. Chinaza visited her parents' grave one evening with a bouquet of flowers she could finally afford. The headstone was simple, and the ground around it smelled of dry earth and the dust of years. She sat and spoke to the photograph she had carried for so long, and told her mother how she had learned to stand without being defined by what others said. "Mama," she whispered, "I survived. I am learning to help others survive too." Neighbors who once spat at her now nodded when they passed. Some came to the sewing center and enrolled. A few offered apologies that were awkward and given with hands that did not know how to be humble. Chinaza accepted some, declined others. Her mercy had limits. It was precise and chosen. She had been wronged, and she had chosen not to let that wrong turn her into a mirror of those who hurt her. Ebuka and Chinaza's marriage did not become a fairy tale overnight. There were days when the past stole sleep, when the memory of insults still came like a sour aftertaste, when trust needed to be rebuilt in the small bricks of daily life. There were also days of laughter that felt honest and bright as properly steeped tea. They built a life around respect, small rituals, and shared purpose. In the end, the thing that changed the village was not the money or the car or the papers that named old crimes. It was the example of a woman who had chosen mercy over revenge, and a man who had chosen to use power not to crush but to test, and then to uplift. Their story moved through the compound like a quiet lesson that did not demand applause. It taught that kindness could be currency, and that dignity was sometimes gained one small act at a time. When Chinaza walked through the compound months later, children ran to greet her, and some of the older women offered a smile that had the edges softened by humility. Uncle Bartholomew worked on his roof with hands that had to relearn the language of honest labor. Auntie Uju kept her words a little kinder. Adiz and Uganma spoke less often, and when they did, their words were thinner with malice. Chinaza understood that justice had many faces, and that one of them was mercy. She kept her photograph of her mother on a bedside table, and every night she thanked the quiet parts of life for teaching her how to be both strong and soft. The road she had walked had been hard, but it had led her to a place where she could finally breathe without expecting insults to fill the space. The past would always be a part of her, but it no longer defined the limits of who she could become.